It says a lot about our great country that the son of a single mum who was a disability pensioner, who grew up in public housing down the road in Camperdown, can stand before you tonight as Australia's Prime Minister.
They can guarantee $16 billion in tax concessions for property investors, but they can't guarantee a cent for public and affordable housing in the middle of the worst housing crisis we have seen in generations.
The housing crisis is the canary in the coal mine for growing wealth inequality between generations, and it's having a profound effect on the shape of Australian politics. The average baby boomer has increasingly supported the coalition over their lifetime, so that there's now a 15.2% deviation in support of the Conservative parties. Generation X has largely followed this pattern, voting increasingly conservative as they age. Millennials have somewhat bucked the trend, still voting slightly more conservative as they age, but remaining on average at an 8% deviation against the coalition. But then there's Gen Z. Their voting patterns present a stark shift. In the decade that they've been voting, they've rejected the coalition in an unprecedented way. But it's not just a problem for the coalition. Gen Z's support for the Labor Party is also taking a nosedive. They're rejecting both the major parties. Meanwhile, their support for independents, minor parties, and the Greens is on the up. And at the risk of stating the obvious, this problem for the major parties is only going to grow. Millennials and Gen Z, or Zoomers, will quickly become the major voting bloc in the country. If their voting trends continue, they have the potential to completely reshape Australian politics. So the next question is why and in what way?
In the immediate term, the threat to Labor is that they're in a minority government by the next election because there are a bunch of disenfranchised voters who helped Labor get elected on a promise of considerable change from the policies that we saw of previous governments. That has not come to pass yet under the current Labor government. So if that disillusionment continues, then maybe Labor will have no choice but to negotiate with the Greens and independents in order to hold a balance of power. The Greens, particularly under Max Chandler-Mather, have been working particularly hard to demonstrate just how hard the cost of living crisis is hitting people, and not just young people. I think people across the board are really starting to recognise the impact that 30 years of austerity have had on this country.
As Claire says, it's not just young people. Every demographic under the age of 55 has seen rates of home ownership drop since the 1980s. And unless either major party can turn this around, it seems voters will start looking elsewhere. So that growing inequality is the why of it, and in part it tells us what its effects will be. A continuation of these voting trends will lead to the rise of a pluralist parliament. But anyone who's frustrated with ineffective governments isn't likely to be satisfied with simply shirking the major parties once every 3 or 4 years at the ballot box, especially young people who don't have much power otherwise. That's where activism becomes an interesting reflection of that frustration.
Federal Labor are giving $100 billion in tax concessions for landlords. The majority of the Federal Labor Party are also landlords who own multiple investment properties, some raking in over $100,000 a year in rents alone.
The fact that inequality is getting worse, I think, means that people are not becoming conservative as they get older. There's nothing to conserve. Protest isn't just about, it's not just symbolic, and it's not just a mechanism to get a seat at the table, but it's actually the key way that students have power to get out there in our numbers.
I have done a lot of things from writing to governments, petitioning governments, lobbying governments. I've met with parliamentarians before, that sort of stuff. And I use that as a tactic to let my communities know that we've worked in really good faith. We've engaged in the best faith that we can with governments, and they've still given us fucking nothing. And that's consistent, right? That's happened time and time and time again. You need to take those values and you need to do something about it. You need to vote progressively. You need to organize progressively. You need to be in your communities, building that sentiment up.
But this approach, trying to push governments from the outside, is leading to pushback. South Australia, New South Wales, Tasmania, Victoria, and Queensland have all passed anti-protest legislation imposing severe penalties on even those engaging in peaceful action. Cherish Kuhlman herself was the subject of a midnight arrest and detention by New South Wales police after her protest at the Reserve Bank of Australia.
They've charged me with aggravated trespassing for standing outside of the Reserve Bank of Australia and drawing attention to the housing crisis facing young people right now. So I'm being faced with 12 months in prison and or a $13,200 fine.
It almost had the opposite effect. Instead of intimidating me or, making me want to take a step back, and it's only made me more determined to keep up the fight.
It's worth taking into consideration the disparity in punishment for people who try to push back against unfair policy. We've had PwC pass on information that was classified to their clients from government. So far, nobody has gone to jail. But if you protest, you could go to jail for 2 years. I mean, what does that say about justice in this country? What does that say about the disparity of power and the disparity of distribution and who gets to wield both of those things?